The courthouse buzzed with activity, its high ceilings echoing the sounds of hurried footsteps, muffled conversations, and the occasional sharp rap of a gavel from one of the courtrooms. It was a dreary morning, the kind where the sun seemed reluctant to rise, leaving the city cloaked in a grey haze. Rain drizzled outside, streaking the courthouse windows and adding to the somber mood. Officer Daniel Hayes leaned against a marble pillar in the courthouse lobby, his arms crossed over his chest. His uniform, crisp and perfectly pressed, was a stark contrast to his demeanor. Hayes was the kind of cop who prided himself on his authority. A man who saw the world in black and white, both literally and figuratively. To him, the courthouse wasn't just a place of law, it was a battleground where he believed he was on the front lines, protecting society from what he saw as its inevitable decay. He scanned the crowd, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he took in the people milling about. Defendants, lawyers, and families shuffled through security checkpoints, their faces etched with worry or indifference. But it wasn't the usual chaos of the courthouse that caught his attention. It was her. She walked in with an air of quiet confidence, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was young, mid-30s at most, and striking in her tailored navy suit. Her natural hair was styled in a crown of curls, and she carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive. But it wasn't her appearance that set Hayes on edge, it was her presence. To Hayes, she didn't belong here. Not in this courthouse, not in that suit, not with that confidence. His jaw tightened as he watched her stride past the security checkpoint without hesitation. Her ID badge clipped neatly to her lapel. Who the hell does she think she is? Hayes muttered under his breath. He pushed off the pillar and started toward her, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. The woman had stopped near the information desk, her back to him as she glanced at a directory on the wall. Hey! Hayes barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the lobby. Several heads turned, but the woman didn't flinch. She turned to face him slowly, her expression calm but guarded. Yes, she said, her voice steady. Hayes stopped a few feet away from her, his hands resting on his belt. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her badge. What are you doing here? He demanded. The woman raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? You heard me, Hayes snapped. This isn't some welfare office. People like you don't just walk in here like you own the place. The lobby seemed to go quieter, the murmurs of the crowd fading as people began to notice the confrontation. The woman's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, disbelief, maybe, or disappointment. I'm here on official business, she said evenly. And I have every right to be here. Hayes took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. Don't play smart with me, girl. You think dressing up like that makes you better than the rest of your kind? You're all the same, lazy, criminals, a drain on society. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered. Is he serious? But Hayes didn't care. His focus was entirely on the woman in front of him. Her composure didn't waver. She met his gaze head-on, her voice calm but firm. I suggest you step back. Officer. Hayes laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Or what? You gonna call for backup? Oh wait, you don't have any. The woman didn't reply. Instead, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder, holding it up for him to see. It was an official document, stamped and signed, but Hayes didn't bother to read it. He slapped it out of her hand, the paper scattering across the floor. Don't pull that crap with me, he snarled. I know exactly what you're trying to do. The woman's eyes narrowed, her calm exterior finally cracking. And what, exactly, am I trying to do? Hayes leaned in, his voice dripping with venom. You're trying to play the system, just like all the others. But not on my watch. Before she could respond, Hayes grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. The crowd gasped again, several people pulling out their phones to record the scene. Let go of me, the woman said, her voice icy. Not until you explain yourself, Hayes retorted, dragging her toward the exit. "Officer Hayes," a voice shouted. It was one of the courthouse security guards, a middle-aged man with a weary expression. He hurried over, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "What's going on here?" "This woman is trespassing," Hayes said without hesitation. "She doesn't belong here." The guard frowned, glancing at the woman's badge. "She has clearance. She's supposed to be here." Hayes scoffed. "Bullshit. She's lying." The woman finally wrenched her arm free, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Enough." Everyone froze. The authority in her tone was undeniable, and for the first time. Hayes hesitated. The woman straightened her suit, brushing off her sleeve where Hayes had grabbed her. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. She flipped it open, revealing a badge, her badge. "I am Captain Maya Carter," she said, her voice ringing out across the lobby. "Your new chief of police." The silence was deafening. Hayes stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. The color drained from his cheeks as the weight of her words sank in. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible." Maya's gaze was steely, her voice unwavering. "Oh, it's very possible. And after what just happened here, I can assure you, Officer Hayes, that your career is over." The crowd erupted into murmurs. Phone still recording as Hayes stumbled back, his mind racing. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but no words came out. Maya turned to the security guard. "Escort him out of the building. I'll deal with him later." The guard nodded, stepping forward to take Hayes by the arm. Hayes didn't resist. He couldn't. His mind was a whirlwind of shame, anger, and fear. As he was led away, the last thing he saw was Maya picking up the scattered papers from the floor, her expression unreadable. And in that moment, Hayes knew his life would never be the same. The video spread like wildfire. By the time Officer Daniel Hayes was escorted out of the courthouse, the confrontation had already been uploaded to social media. Within hours, it was trending nationwide. The footage was damning, a white officer berating and physically restraining a black woman, spewing venomous, racist remarks in front of a stunned crowd, only to discover that she was Captain Maya Carter, the newly appointed chief of police. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. News outlets picked up the story, playing the video on an endless loop. Headlines screamed of institutional racism, police brutality, and the audacity of a man like Hayes. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse by nightfall, their signs demanding justice and systemic reform. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was equally volatile. Hayes sat in the small, windowless room, his hands clasped tightly on the metal table in front of him. His uniform, once a symbol of pride, now felt suffocating. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows across his face. He hadn't spoken much since being brought back to the station. His colleagues, those who had once laughed at his jokes and slapped him on the back, now avoided his gaze. He could feel their judgment, their disgust, and, for some, their fear. The door opened, and Maya Carter walked in. She wasn't in uniform. Instead, she wore the same tailored suit from earlier, though now her jacket was unbuttoned, revealing a crisp white blouse beneath. She carried a folder in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Her heels clicked against the floor as she approached the table, setting the folder down with deliberate precision. Hayes didn't look up. "Officer Hayes," she began, her tone measured but cold. "Do you know why you're here?" He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yes," he muttered. Maya raised an eyebrow. "That's a change. You didn't seem to have much respect for me earlier today." Hayes flinched at the reminder, his jaw tightening. "I didn't know who you were." "That much is clear," Maya said, sitting down across from him. She opened the folder, pulling out a stack of papers. "But that doesn't excuse your behavior." Not today, and not in the past. Hayes' head snapped up at that. The past? Maya's eyes locked onto his, unflinching. Yes, the past. Do you think this is the first complaint I've received about you since I started this job? Because it's not. She slid a paper across the table. It was a formal complaint, dated 2 years prior, detailing an incident in which Hayes had used excessive force during a traffic stop involving a black man. You were cleared of wrongdoing in this case, Maya continued, her voice sharp. But only because there wasn't enough evidence to prove otherwise. Convenient, isn't it? How body cameras seem to malfunction at just the right moment? Hayes clenched his fists, his face reddening. I did my job. That's all I've ever done. No, Maya said, leaning forward. What you've done is abuse your power. You've let your biases dictate your actions, and you've tarnished the badge you wear. And today, you crossed a line you can't come back from. Hayes opened his mouth to argue, but Maya cut him off. Save it, she snapped. I'm not interested in your excuses. Do you even realize the damage you've done? To me, to this department. To the community we're supposed to serve? Her voice rose slightly, the anger she'd been holding back slipping through. People like you are the reason this city doesn't trust us. You're the reason parents teach their children to fear the police. And now, thanks to your actions, every officer in this department will have to work twice as hard to earn back the trust you destroyed in a single afternoon. Hayes slumped in his chair, the weight of her words pressing down on him. For the first time, he felt something other than anger or indignation. He felt shame. I didn't mean for it to go that far, he said quietly. Maya's expression softened, but only slightly. Intent doesn't matter, Hayes. Impact does. She stood, gathering the papers back into the folder. You're suspended without pay, effective immediately. An internal investigation is already underway. And I can promise you this, if I find even a shred of evidence that today wasn't an isolated incident, you will be fired. And if the DA decides to press charges, you'll face those consequences too. Hayes looked up at her, his eyes pleading. Chief Carter, please. Don't, she said, cutting him off. You don't get to ask me for anything. Not after what you did. With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Hayes alone in the cold, fluorescent light. Outside the precinct, the protests had grown. Hundreds of people filled the streets, their voices rising in unison as they chanted for justice. Signs bearing slogans like "End Police Brutality" and "Black Lives Matter" waved in the air, illuminated by the glow of streetlights and camera flashes. Maya stood at the window of her office, looking down at the crowd. She could hear their voices even through the thick glass. A constant hum of anger and determination. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her. She turned and picked it up, seeing the name of the mayor on the screen. With a sigh, she answered. Mayor Jacobs. She said. Maya, the mayor replied, his voice tense. I just got off the phone with the governor. He's demanding answers. This situation is spiraling out of control. I'm aware, Maya said. And I'm handling it. Are you? The mayor asked, his tone skeptical. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your department is falling apart. Maya's grip on the phone tightened. With all due respect, Mayor, this isn't just my department's problem. This is a systemic issue, and it's been ignored for far too long. Today was just the tipping point. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When the mayor spoke again, his voice was quieter. What do you need from me? Maya exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I need your support. Publicly. I need the city to know that we're committed to change, and that starts with accountability. Hayes will be dealt with, but that's not enough. We need to address the root of the problem. The mayor hesitated, but eventually, he said, all right. I'll back you. But you'd better have a plan, Maya. The city is watching. I always do, she replied, hanging up. Back at his apartment, Hayes sat on the couch, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. The television was on, playing yet another segment about the courthouse incident. He muted it, unable to listen to the commentators dissect his every word and action. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, but he ignored it. He already knew what the messages would say. Some would be from his family, expressing their disappointment. Others would be from old friends, offering half-hearted support. And then there were the messages from strangers, threats, insults, and accusations that he was everything wrong with the world. He took another swig of whiskey, the burn in his throat doing little to numb the ache in his chest. For the first time in his life, Hayes felt powerless. The badge that had once been his shield, his identity, now sat on the table in front of him, a cold, lifeless piece of metal. He stared at it, his mind racing with memories of every decision that had led him to this moment. And for the first time, he wondered if Maya Carter was right. The city was at a boiling point. Protests outside the precinct had swelled to thousands, spilling into neighboring streets and drawing national attention. News vans lined the blocks, their satellite dishes pointed skyward as reporters delivered live updates. The courthouse incident had become a flashpoint in a larger conversation about systemic racism and police accountability. And the city's response, or lack thereof, was under a microscope. Inside the precinct, the tension was palpable. Officers moved through the halls with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with each other. Conversations were hushed, and every glance seemed to carry the weight of unspoken questions. Whose side are you on? What happens next? At the center of it all was Maya Carter. Maya stood at the front of a packed community hall, her hands resting on the podium. The crowd was a mix of protesters, activists, concerned citizens, and even a few off-duty officers. The air was thick with anger and frustration, but also a flicker of hope, the hope that Maya could deliver the change they so desperately needed. Behind her, a projector displayed the words Community Accountability Forum in bold letters. A stack of note cards sat on the podium, filled with questions submitted by attendees. Maya hadn't prepared a speech. She didn't need one. Good evening, she began, her voice steady but firm. My name is Maya Carter, and I am the chief of police for this city. I want to start by saying that I'm not here to defend what happened at the courthouse. There is no defense for it. What Officer Hayes did was unacceptable, and he will be held accountable. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of agreement and skepticism. But accountability isn't just about one officer, Maya continued. It's about the system that allowed someone like him to thrive. It's about the culture within our department, and the failures of leadership, failures that I am now responsible for fixing. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, every eye on her. I won't stand here and make empty promises, she said. Change won't happen overnight, and it won't be easy. But it will happen. And it starts with transparency. She gestured to a table at the side of the stage, where stacks of documents were laid out. These are the disciplinary records for every officer in this department, including my own. Starting today, they're public. You have the right to know who is protecting and serving your community. The crowd erupted into applause, though some people still looked wary. Maya held up a hand, signaling for quiet. I'm also implementing mandatory bias training and community engagement programs for all officers, she said. And I'm establishing an independent review board made up of civilians, people like you, to oversee complaints against the department. No more internal investigations that go nowhere. No more excuses. A man in the back of the room stood up, his voice cutting through the applause. That's all well and good, Chief Carter, but what about Hayes? What about the other officers like him who are still out there? Maya met his gaze, her expression resolute. Hayes is under investigation, and I've recommended termination. As for the others, if they can't meet the standards of integrity and respect that this job demands, they won't wear the badge. Period. The man nodded, sitting back down. Maya scanned the room. her eyes meeting those of the people who had come to demand answers. "This is your city," she said. "Your police department. And I'm here to rebuild it, with you, not for you. But I need your help. Hold me accountable. Hold us all accountable. Together, we can make this right." The room erupted into a standing ovation, but Maya didn't feel relief. She felt the weight of the work ahead. Daniel Hayes sat in his dimly lit apartment, the curtains drawn tight against the world outside. The bottle of whiskey on the coffee table was nearly empty. And the television played muted news coverage of the protests. His phone buzzed incessantly, but he ignored it. He hadn't left his apartment in days. The department had officially placed him on suspension, and the internal investigation loomed like a dark cloud over his head. He knew what was coming. Termination was inevitable. And criminal charges weren't out of the question. The shame was unbearable. He couldn't escape the video, the sound of his own voice spewing hatred and ignorance. It played on a loop in his mind, haunting him. For the first time, Hayes allowed himself to think about why he had become a cop in the first place. He had told himself it was to serve and protect, to make a difference. But somewhere along the way, that ideal had been twisted into something ugly. His authority had become a weapon, his biases a shield. He picked up his badge from the coffee table, turning it over in his hands. It felt heavier than he remembered. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Hayes froze, his heart pounding. He wasn't expecting anyone. Reluctantly, he got up and opened the door. Standing there was Officer Maria Lopez, one of his closest colleagues in the department. She looked at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment. "Maria," he said, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "I came to check on you," she replied. "You've been radio silent, and, well, people are talking." Hayes stepped aside, letting her in. She glanced around the apartment, taking in the empty bottles and unwashed dishes. "You look like hell," she said bluntly. Hayes collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "I screwed up. Maria. I screwed up so bad." She sat down across from him, her expression softening. "Yeah, you did. But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed. "What can I do? It's over for me. My career, my reputation, everything." Maria leaned forward, her voice firm. "It's only over if you let it be. You messed up, Hayes, but you still have a choice. You can either keep running from this, or you can face it head-on. Own up to what you did. Apologize. Try to make it right." Hayes shook his head. "No one will forgive me." "Maybe not," Maria said. "But forgiveness isn't the point. Accountability is. Redemption is. You can't change what you've done, but you can decide what kind of man you want to be moving forward." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For the first time in days, Hayes felt a glimmer of clarity. A week later, the precinct held a press conference. The city was still reeling, but progress had been made. The independent review board was being assembled, and several officers had already been reassigned pending further investigation. Maya stood at the podium, flanked by members of the community and city officials. Cameras flashed as she addressed the crowd. "Today is a turning point," she began. "Not just for our department, but for our city. We have a long road ahead, but I believe we can walk it together." She stepped aside, and to everyone's surprise, Daniel Hayes walked onto the stage. The crowd murmured in shock, some booing, others falling silent. Hayes approached the podium, his hands trembling. He looked out at the sea of faces, his heart pounding. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he began, his voice shaky. "What I did was wrong. It was hateful, it was ignorant, and it was inexcusable. I failed as an officer, and I failed as a human being." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But I'm here today because I want to take responsibility. I want to apologize, not just to Chief Carter, but to everyone I've hurt. I don't expect redemption. But I'm committed to doing the work to become a better person. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then someone began to clap. Slowly, others joined in, until the applause filled the room. Maya stepped back to the podium, her expression unreadable. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Change starts with accountability, but it doesn't end there. Together, we will build a better future." The press conference ended, but the work was far from over. For Maya, for Hayes, and for the city, the reckoning had only just begun. The city was still healing. The courthouse incident had left scars on the community, on the police department, and on the people at the center of it all. But amid the pain and anger, there were also signs of hope. Protests had turned into forums, outrage into dialogue, and demands into concrete action. Maya Carter stood at the forefront of this transformation. But she knew better than anyone that progress was fragile. One misstep, one failure, and everything they had worked for could come crashing down. The precinct's largest conference room was packed with officers, community leaders, and city officials. Maya stood at the head of the room. A projector casting the words Community Partnership Program onto the wall behind her. "This program is about rebuilding trust," Maya began, her voice steady but firm. "It's about breaking down the walls that have divided us for too long. And it starts with all of you." She gestured to the officers in the room, many of whom looked skeptical. "You've been assigned to specific neighborhoods, not just to patrol them, but to become a part of them. You'll attend community meetings, volunteer at local events, and work directly with residents to address their concerns." One officer raised his hand. "Chief, with all due respect, isn't this just a PR stunt? People don't trust us. How is showing up at a bake sale supposed to change that?" Maya's gaze was sharp. Trust isn't rebuilt with grand gestures. It's rebuilt one interaction at a time. By showing people that you're not just here to enforce the law, but to serve them. If you're not willing to do that, you're in the wrong profession. The room fell silent. Maya let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "This isn't optional," she said. "It's the new standard. And if anyone has a problem with that, my office door is open." She paused, scanning the room. "But let me be clear, this isn't about making you feel comfortable. It's about making the community feel safe." The meeting ended with a mix of cautious optimism and lingering doubt. Maya knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew it was necessary. Daniel Hayes stood in front of a classroom filled with teenagers. It was part of his court-mandated community service, but for Hayes, it was more than that. It was a chance to confront his past and try to make amends. The program, called Bridging the Gap, brought police officers and at-risk youth together to share their experiences and foster understanding. Hayes had been reluctant at first, but now he found himself looking forward to these sessions. A young boy in the back raised his hand. "Why did you do it?" he asked bluntly. "Why did you treat Chief Carter like that?" The room went silent, all eyes on Hayes. He took a deep breath. His hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Because I was ignorant," he admitted. "I let my biases control me. I thought I was better than her, better than people who looked like her. And I was wrong." The boy frowned. "But you were a cop. Aren't you supposed to protect people?" Hayes nodded. "Yes, I was. And I failed. I forgot what it meant to serve and protect. But I'm trying to do better now. I can't change what I did, but I can change who I am moving forward." The boy didn't look convinced, but he didn't press further. Hayes knew he had a long way to go before he could earn the trust of these kids, or anyone, for that matter. But he was willing to put in the work. Months passed. And the city began to feel the effects of Maya's reforms. Complaints against the police department dropped significantly, and community events became regular occurrences. Officers who had once been seen as adversaries were now being invited into people's homes for coffee and conversation. But not everyone was on board. A faction of officers within the department resisted the changes, grumbling about political correctness and soft policing. Maya knew she couldn't win everyone over. But she also knew she couldn't ignore the dissent. One evening, she called a meeting with the department's leadership team. "I know some of you think these reforms are a waste of time," she said. Her tone unwavering. "You think we're pandering, that we're losing sight of what it means to be cops. But let me ask you this, what does it mean to be a cop?" The room was silent. Maya continued. "Does it mean wielding power over people? Or does it mean serving them? Does it mean enforcing the law at all costs? Or does it mean upholding justice?" She looked around the room, her gaze piercing. "If you're here for power, you don't belong in this department. If you're here to serve, then prove it. Show this city that we're capable of change. That we're worthy of their trust." One by one. The officers in the room nodded. Maya knew not all of them were convinced, but she also knew that change often started with a single step. 6 months after the courthouse incident, the city held a public event to celebrate the progress that had been made. The park was filled with people from all walks of life, families, activists, officers, and city officials. Maya stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd. She felt a swell of pride, but also a deep sense of responsibility. 6 months ago, our city was at a crossroads, she began. We could have let anger and division tear us apart. But instead, we chose to come together. We chose to listen, to learn, and to grow. She gestured to the officers standing behind her. These men and women have worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust that was broken. They've shown that change is possible, not just in policy, but in hearts and minds. The crowd erupted into applause. Maya stepped back, letting the moment wash over her. In the distance, she spotted Daniel Hayes standing near the edge of the crowd. He wasn't in uniform, he never would be again, but he was there. Listening. Their eyes met, and he gave her a small nod. Maya nodded back. Redemption wasn't easy, and it wasn't guaranteed. But for Hayes, for the department, and for the city, it was a journey worth taking. The courthouse incident had become a turning point in the city's history. Years later, its ripple effects could still be felt, not just in the policies that were implemented, but in the culture that had begun to shift. The journey wasn't perfect, nor was it complete. But the city was undeniably different. Maya Carter's name was now synonymous with reform and resilience. Her tenure as chief of police had redefined what it meant to lead. And her story became a beacon for other cities grappling with similar challenges. But as Maya prepared to step down from her position, she couldn't help but reflect on the road she had traveled and the legacy she would leave behind. The city auditorium was packed, every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Maya stood at the podium, her uniform immaculate, her badge gleaming under the bright lights. This was her final address as chief of police, and the weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. 11 years ago, I stood in front of you as a newly appointed chief, facing one of the most difficult challenges of my life, she began. The courthouse incident was a moment of reckoning, not just for me, but for this city and this department. It forced us to confront uncomfortable truths and to ask ourselves hard questions about who we were and who we wanted to be. She paused, scanning the crowd. Today, I stand before you. Not to claim victory, but to acknowledge progress. We've come a long way, but the work isn't done. It never will be. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And it's one we must continue together. The crowd erupted into applause, but Maya wasn't finished. I want to thank the people of this city for holding us accountable, she said. For demanding better. For believing that change was possible, even when it seemed out of reach. And I want to thank the officers who embraced that change, who chose courage over complacency. And service over self-interest. She stepped back from the podium, her heart swelling as the crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation. This wasn't just her legacy, it was theirs. Daniel Hayes had spent years trying to atone for his actions. After being terminated from the police force, he had thrown himself into community work, volunteering at youth centers and speaking at schools about the dangers of bias and prejudice. Slowly but surely, he had rebuilt his life and his reputation. Now, he stood in front of a classroom at the city's police academy, addressing a group of cadets. "When I first became a cop, I thought the badge gave me power," he said. "But I was wrong. The badge doesn't give you power, it gives you responsibility. Responsibility to serve, to protect, and to uphold the values of justice and equality." He looked around the room, his gaze steady. "I lost sight of that responsibility, and I paid the price. But I'm standing here today to make sure you don't make the same mistakes I did. Because being a cop isn't about you, it's about the people you serve." The cadets nodded, their expression serious. Hayes knew he couldn't erase his past, but he hoped he could use it to shape a better future. Maya sat on a park bench, watching as children played on the swings and families gathered for picnics. The park was part of a revitalization project she had championed during her time as chief, transforming an abandoned lot into a vibrant community space. Beside her sat Officer Maria Lopez, now a captain in the department. "You know, it's going to be weird not having you around," Maria said, sipping her coffee. Maya smiled. "You'll do just fine without me. Besides, it's time for the next generation to take the lead." Maria nodded. "Still, it won't be the same. You've changed the way we do things, Maya. You've changed the way we think." Maya's smile faded slightly. "Change is fragile, Maria. It's up to you, and everyone else, to keep it alive. Don't let complacency creep back in. Don't let the work stop." Maria reached over, placing a hand on Maya's shoulder. "We won't. I promise." The two women sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun began to set. Years later, a plaque was unveiled outside the courthouse. It read, "In honor of Chief Maya Carter, whose leadership turned a moment of crisis into a movement for change. May we always strive for justice, equity, and accountability." A small crowd gathered for the unveiling, including Maya herself. She stood quietly at the back, her hair now streaked with gray, her face lined with age but still full of determination. Nearby, a young girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Who's Maya Carter?" she asked. Her mother smiled. "She's the reason we're here today. She's the reason things are better." Maya listened, her heart swelling with pride. She didn't need recognition or accolades. Knowing she had made a difference was enough. As the crowd began to disperse, Maya walked away, blending into the city she had dedicated her life to serving. Her legacy wasn't just in the policies she had implemented or the reforms she had championed, it was in the lives she had touched and the hope she had inspired. And that, she knew, would endure.